This program contains graphic imagery. Viewer discretion is advised.
Friday is the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Some people wonder why the war is taking so long.
We can tell you that 2010 was the deadliest year for U.S. troops yet.
10 years in, the U.S. was no closer to winning the war in Afghanistan than when it had first arrived. Over 2,700 coalition soldiers had been killed in action. Close to $500 billion had been spent, and the Taliban were still gaining ground. But President Obama had a plan.
Our nations agreed on a framework that would allow us to responsibly wind down the war.
After trying a troop surge in 2009, Obama now planned to draw down America's commitment
We've made important progress.
and hand over all the fighting to the Afghan military and police by 2014.
Afghan forces will take the lead for combat operations across the country.
It was a move that would have major consequences. The mission shifted from thousands of U.S. boots on the ground to more high-tech attacks from the air. Large counterinsurgency operations were gradually exchanged for smaller task forces targeting Taliban and al-Qaeda insurgents. It was a strategy commonly referred to as kill-capture, but it would often backfire and ultimately strengthen support for the Taliban.
These are largely small unit operations. 1 or 2 helicopters land outside a compound based on an intelligence assessment, often telephone calls and so forth, that indicate that there was an enemy force in that compound, so typically Taliban.
Initially, these raids were secretive. But on May 2nd, 2011, when special forces snuck into Pakistan and killed Osama bin Laden, the scope of the raids became widely known.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda.
The top leadership of the Taliban, of al-Qaeda, those senior leaders had to be detained, or if they resisted detention, killed.
General David Petraeus, a staunch proponent of winning hearts and minds through counterinsurgency, also embraced these raids or targeted killings. Restraints put in place by his predecessor, General Stanley McChrystal, were loosened, and the number of raids would increase sixfold.
By the time I took command in 2010, we were conducting somewhere between 10 and 15 operations on a given night against high-value targets of the insurgent networks and the extremist groups that were trying to reestablish the sanctuary in Afghanistan. Keep in mind, it's just not the guys going through doors. It's not just the operators. It's the drones that are on top of it. It's all of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance structure that we have to create to identify where the high-value targets are.
Hit the guy on the road, Roger, hit the guy on the road.
And then to overwatch the conduct of an operation with AC-130 gunships at night and attack helicopters if you need them and all the rest.
In 2010, I embedded with a group of soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division and an elite team of Army Rangers who were conducting targeted raids. We choppered across Host Province to a small combat outpost along the Afghan-Pakistan border.
So if we do have detainees, we're going to flex them with the first lift, and MPs are going to take over from there.
Soldiers were preparing for some raids the next day, reviewing new intelligence on the whereabouts of suspected Taliban militants.
With that being said, new threats in Mamundi. Scott and Chris.
These guys are part of Muhammad Amin's cell, operate out of Mamundi. These guys are new. They're new faces. We haven't seen them before. On the sheet after the HLZ, I got the compounds labeled and their label next to their names here on the first sheet. So everybody needs to be tracking these guys. Keep an eye out.
All right, any questions? All right.
We set out at dawn. The team was accompanied by a contingent of Afghan police in the ongoing effort to train Afghan forces.
The mission was a combined operation between ABP, Afghan Border Police, and coalition forces to ultimately clear suspected safe houses in 3 villages. We had about 17 persons of interest that we wanted to at least talk to.
All right, there's a door to the left. We'll go in immediately now.
The targeted raids around this area have been very successful.
One window and then the section of the
We've taken out cells and attacks have decreased significantly. But with that being said, a new cell is created, not necessarily in the same area, but ultimately the same effects on us. So it's the cat and mouse game.
These operations came with risks.
We're very focused on capturing members of Taliban leadership and capturing al-Qaeda. So we would go into a house, go into an area, and detain people or kill them. Now, sometimes the information that we got for that could be bad. It could be that someone who we were working with had some kind of grievance against a potential person, gave that information to the Americans so that we could conduct an attack.
More time, more time. Something wrong.
Within minutes of entering one compound, the team discovered a problem.
We're obviously in here.
They had the wrong location. They had raided the home of a tribal elder. Although the elder appears innocent, the soldiers decide to conduct a search anyway. They risk causing further offense, which put the accompanying Afghan forces in an awkward position. The raid turned up next to nothing. Captain Keller told me that the way they carried out the raids had to keep changing, in part because the Taliban kept adapting.
Insurgency changes daily.
Yeah, this might be the same guy.
What the last unit was fighting 6 to 12 months ago, we're fighting something new.
That is Masakan? Yeah. We're going to search the rear.
If they know how we fight, they're going to change their tactics. We learn how they fight, so we change ours. So it's very difficult to just focus on one objective or one mission.
Hey, we're in Bravo 1, and we got targets 7 and 8. Hey, Halimi, I don't want them sitting next to each other.
I mean, if one thing's not working, we need to try another. And if that doesn't work, then, you know, and the cycle just goes around.
You can go on for a long time.
It could go on for another day or another 10 years.
Years later, after the fall of Kabul in 2021, I returned to Afghanistan. It was clear that for Afghans, night raids had been a major feature of the war. This is the road to Wardak province, once a hotbed of Taliban activity. The road is pockmarked from hundreds of IED explosions used by the Taliban to attack U.S. convoys.
This is his house?
Wardak was a frequent target of kill-capture teams.
چې د پاسه وار وشو درون وار وشو هر شي نور نو بس ملته ځای په ځای ځلوېدلی وم یو دلته شهید شوی و یو دلته و یو په دغو ځای کې و نور دغلته و دا مې ته دو ځای خطر دغه سینه مې ښه مې دغه ټول ځایونه په دستوني کې دلته لګېدلی یو 130 کوکه مې خوړلي یو 130 نه هم زیات و بیا په ایمرجنسي کې هم 14 ورځې مې هلته ووتې د هغو ځای بیا پسې چې خارج شوم دلته چې راغلم 14 نفره شهیدان وو 2 مې ورونه وو 2 مې د کاکا زمن وو 3 2 لمسیان وو نور په دې کلي کې ټول د خپل یوه کورنۍ وه ټوله
Why did the drone attack this group?
نه پوهېږم
Were there Taliban in your group?
یاره نه
We couldn't verify this attack, but everyone here seemed to have a story.
سبب ویای شو به څوره وی خو ولا کې یو ورځ پرې کې وی چوپنه چې سو چوپاین په وایلی خو درګردم دا تلاشي بده
Mohammed Alam, a taxi driver, told me about a night raid on his house. One night in October 2009, he was home with his children and 2 brothers. Was there anybody in the house that was Taliban?
یو وخت وجرا په وجرا کې ولمانه وو نه د نه خبر شي بس حکم طلب ولمانه وو و د وطن خلک که ارڅ کروشي موږ د ټکاله ورکی و ډوډۍ ورکی و مخې پرېږدنه
Alam says he was not Taliban, nor, he says, were his brothers.
او ورور مې شهید کو شغاونی خصای منصب و خبر حاله و خب کاری کو پم دو بګرغلای و کورته دروازه ول وزوله پیرونه شروع کړ دا ورور مې په ځای کې پروت و یو ور کسه د مشمون سای پروت و دا دروازه ول وزوله او دا چې څنګه دروازه ورخلاص کړی و سم د لاسه شهید کړی و چې دا غلطي وشتلای و او په دې ځای وشتلای و دلته وشتلای و په دغه ځای وشتلای و
Alam says that after his brother was killed, their house was then set on fire, and he was taken to Bagram prison with another brother. He spent 4 years there, and, he says, he was never charged with any crime. But the experience turned him against the Americans.
دا غدي چې زه ویني د باګرام نه خوشا شولم خو د مو زدار ازل وشو چې داسې طرفدار وم چې په خپل مرګ راځم چې زه به یو پیدوي به کوم ځکه زه به مو سای ډیر ظلم کړای خو مو ونه کړ پم دمه ونه کړ چې د وړه مشمون می و د کور می و د کور په سر می ونه کړ چې د دوی ته وسر په هغه پاک دوکم زندگی یو کور شامل لرلم نه پکې د دوی په خوري په مدختاو
حالتی که جنگ علیه تروریسم بر افغانستان آمد که باعث اعمالی در خاک ما شد که
Throughout his presidency, Hamid Karzai spoke out publicly against civilian deaths from raids and other errant attacks.
We are going to ask the international community to end nighttime raids on Afghan homes and eliminate civilian casualties.
President Karzai increasingly became better. The raiding of houses, night raids, he was strictly opposed to it. But the thing that particularly annoyed President Karzai was the killing of civilians. And it repeatedly happened.
In Ghazni province, central Afghanistan, the dead include a woman and a child, following what eyewitnesses say was a raid by US forces.
Certainly the province of Kunar has had more than its fair share of civilian casualties.
Digging small graves for 9 children, all under 14. General David Petraeus has since apologized for the deaths.
Karzai repeatedly complained to General Petraeus that raids were backfiring. Protests were mounting, even as Petraeus made efforts to reduce civilian casualties.
The accumulation of civilian casualties, mistakes, all mistakes, to be clear. I mean, we were very, very tough.
Karzai complained repeatedly. He told you that you had to stop running night raids.
Again, I understand absolutely the pressures that Karzai was under, and I sought to convey to him the challenges with which I was having to deal as the commander of U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan. War is full of mistakes, full of incredible loss, tragedy, heartbreak, hardship, and casualties.
When I asked General Petraeus about this, he says, look, well, war is messy. These things happen.
Yeah, no, it happens, but we virtually never held anyone accountable for civilian casualties. I mean, we paid condolences, and sometimes we said it wasn't us, or sorry, it's a mistake, but we never held anybody accountable.
This footage, shot by the Taliban, appears to show ISAF airstrikes on another village in Kunar. A government inquiry found 65 civilian casualties. ISAF said it found no evidence that civilians were killed. General Petraeus went even further, suggesting that some of the children's burns may be down to parental discipline, not ISAF.
I remember that conversation with General Petraeus about civilians killed in Kunar, and some children had survived. They were in hospital.
As a minister in President Karzai's government, Omar Zakhiwal sat in on key meetings.
And then what infuriated President Karzai in that conversation was when General Petraeus said, look, these children are trained by their fathers to say the story. So they're put in risk by their parents there, and they just want to defame us.
In February 20th of 2011, there was a closed-door meeting at the palace, and there was talk about an attack in Kunar, and you made a comment that you believed that some of the families might have deliberately injured their own children in order to spark a reaction against the Americans.
No, that's mythology. I would never say something like that. I never did. It's absolutely wrong.
But the story circulated widely and made it to the Washington Post, CNN, and other news outlets. General Petraeus denies being aware of the story.
I'd never heard that story before.
You've been asked in the past for comment.
I've never heard of that story. Again, if I was asked, I clearly don't remember it, and it's not something that I ever would have said. This is just nonsensical.
Afghan officials have repeatedly called for an end to night raids, alleging that such operations are disruptive to Afghan lives and lead to civilian casualties.
The number of targeted raids fell after General Petraeus left. His successor was General John Allen.
This last year, we had about 2,200 night operations. In all of those, there was less than 1.5% civilian casualties. Now, I don't diminish any civilian casualties by reducing it to a percentage point. But after 9,200 night operations, 27 people were killed or wounded. That would argue for the power of night operations preserving life.
Those are very impressive statistics, and
the Pentagon's civilian casualty statistics are impressive and widely dismissed as underreported.
So there has not been a lot of transparency around this for many years now. So they run this civilian casualty mitigation.
Azmat Khan won a Pulitzer Prize for her work investigating civilians killed in airstrikes. She says the Pentagon has been inconsistent in releasing reliable data.
So they put out these numbers in reports to Congress every year, and they'll admit a certain number of incidents. But I can't calculate it for Afghanistan the way I could for Iraq and Syria because they did not consistently put out numbers the way Iraq and Syria did, or maintain a total caseload of numbers.
So we don't know.
So you can do it for 2018 and 2019, but it's very hard to do before that because they did not release those numbers.
It pains us all here to know what you must be going through right now with the loss that you just suffered.
I'm deeply sorry.
Oftentimes when we do an errant strike, we'd accidentally kill some civilians. We'd go and we'd make a peace offering. Hey, here's
Lieutenant Colonel Jason Dempsey served 2 rotations in Afghanistan.
We would pay that family the equivalent of 2 goats and a couple $1,000s because you accidentally killed their uncle.
What we can do is try to help you out with a payment for your losses. It's the absolute least that we can do. because obviously you can't bring back someone you love.
You think it's over, but it's not, because the irony, of course, was they didn't forgive us. Yeah, they nodded politely when they're in a room full of Americans and Afghan security forces, but they held those grudges, and they did accumulate over time, not only in an individual action, but in the narratives our enemies were building about us being indiscriminate killers. You know, our failure rate, if it's 1-2% out of hundreds and thousands of strikes per year, you can build a hell of a lot of stories about the evil Americans if you're screwing up 2%, and I guarantee we're screwing up more than that.
Gentlemen, this is for you, for your losses. The U.S. Marines, the citizens of Afghanistan, and the government of Afghanistan together can achieve great things to make Afghanistan a safer and more prosperous place for all.
In February 2013, days after 5 children were killed in another raid in Kunar province, Karzai finally ordered a ban on Afghan troops calling in U.S. and NATO air support. In November of that year, he tried to take it even further. For years, there had been growing concern among some U.S. officials that the Pentagon simply could not win the war by force. Beginning as early as 2009, they had pursued a secret parallel track: peace through negotiations.
The American delegation came to my home.
Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif was one of the original founders of the Taliban, along with their supreme leader, Mullah Omar. Zaif, who was under house arrest in Kabul, recalls a visit from some Americans asking him to help.
He said, we don't know how to find a solution.
But that was the message, that we think we can't win this by force.
Yeah.
So we want to talk.
Yeah. But my advice was to them to talk to the Taliban, to give political office, recognize the Taliban as a legal party, not terrorist.
A small group of us began to explore potential outreach to the Taliban. There were loose intelligence reports of, so-and-so wants to talk, or here's the guy who says he's connected. Here's a guy who says he knows the leadership, someone who speaks for Mullah Omar.
Eventually, they were able to get in touch with a man who claimed to speak for Supreme Leader Mullah Omar.
The deceptively boyish Saeed Tayyad Agha. This is as close as you are likely to get to the Taliban leader.
We found this fellow by the name of Tayyab Agha, a former Taliban government official.
And we will defend our religion.
And he was also a close personal associate of Mullah Omar, who happened to be in an accessible place, Doha, Qatar. So a place we could actually visit.
Doha, 1,200 miles to the west of Kabul on the Persian Gulf. How does Tayyab Agha become the chief negotiator?
He was the political responsible at that time.
But he's a very young man.
He was young or not, but he was responsible.
So how did he have that position?
I don't know. This was the leadership decided.
So Mullah Omar and he were close.
Yeah, he was the close friend of Mullah Muhammad. He was working with him before that. He was a trustable person for him.
The task of exploring talks with Agha fell to an old hand, diplomat Richard Holbrook. Together with an advisor, Barnett Rubin, they devised a plan to vet Agha.
We said to Tayyab Agha, can you bring us a message from Bo Bergdahl?
Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, the only American prisoner of war held in Afghanistan.
Holbrook and Rubin also asked that Agha tell Mullah Omar to release a special message.
We told him that the message should include some comments on some recent events in Somalia.
American soldier Bo Bergdahl was captured in eastern Afghanistan.
They reasoned that if Agha proved he had access to Bergdahl, the Taliban's prized American prisoner, and to Mullah Omar, Agha would pass their test. But the Pentagon was against any negotiation. The military believed it was too soon for talks.
The military was always saying, okay, we know there has to be a political settlement, but we should wait till we're in a stronger position. And I used to say, why do you think you'll be in a stronger position if you wait? If you want to negotiate when you have maximum leverage, you're a couple years too late already.
I am supporting direct talks with Taliban. They've indicated a readiness to talk.
Holbrooke recorded his thoughts on tape.
Petraeus is strongly opposing all this. He says he wants to do it only when the time is right, which he says will be next year, by which time he'll have had more military success. Frankly, I just don't believe him.
Over Holbrooke's objections, the Pentagon put Holbrooke and Rubin on a tight leash as far as talking with Talieb Aga.
The military was adamant. You can meet him and talk to him, but you cannot negotiate anything. You have no authorization to it. So, but they agreed that we could meet him, and the president signed off on that.
But before any real talks were held, everything came to a halt. Holbrooke was hospitalized in Washington with a rare heart ailment.
Holbrooke would have continued on, maybe this would have all worked out differently. But it didn't. That's not what happened. He passed away. I got this job. I did the best I could.
The responsibility to bringing peace to Afghanistan.
Ambassador Mark Grossman, another veteran State Department official, took over the job of negotiating in February 2011. He met several times with Aga at various locations in Doha, pressing the Taliban to talk with Karzai's government. But it wasn't happening.
It became clear, certainly in the second or third negotiation, that they weren't interested in talking to the Karzai government.
The Taliban had a different agenda.
I think they saw in front of them the opportunity to get their senior leadership out of Guantanamo.
The talks were stalled. Grossman left in December 2012. Wanting to revive the talks, Barnett Rubin stayed on as a consultant and tried to clear the way for a Taliban political office in Doha. At the time, the Taliban were headquartered in Pakistan, where they had been granted sanctuary. Pakistan protected them, but also watched them closely.
They want to have a political office. As Zaif said to me, you will not know what the Taliban true positions are until they have a political office outside Pakistan. But as long as they're in Pakistan, they cannot say anything.
You wanted legitimacy and recognition.
Yeah, and don't mention the Taliban, they are terrorists. Recognize them as a party, as a legal party, not terrorists.
In return, the Taliban were to agree that they would not infringe on the Karzai government's sovereignty. At the proposed office, they would not fly their flag, and they would not identify themselves as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. It didn't go according to plan.
I'm flying back to Doha, and at that time there was no internet on airplanes. And I start scrolling through my BlackBerry, and I said, my God, what happened? The Taliban had a press conference on Al Jazeera with a big sign saying Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They raised the flag of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. This cannot stand, you know. This is a violation of the agreement.
So, I mean, you've got to be pretty upset.
I was pretty upset, yeah.
The name Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan suggests it's an embassy representing an actual government.
The mistrust is rampant between the Taliban and the Afghan government and the U.S. You wonder where these negotiations are going to go.
The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan simultaneously follows both military and political options.
Another Taliban leader, Muhammad Suhail Shaheen, was at the new office the day it was to open.
With the United Nations.
One of the agreements that you had made is that you would not call yourselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and you would not raise your flag, but you did that. Why?
No, that was not. It is not true.
I have pictures.
You have pictures. I was there. It is not needed. The Americans call us as Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. It's up to them. But we have right to call ourselves Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Everyone has the right, and everyone has a flag. Even if you go to a football team, they have their own flag.
Just 24 hours ago, there was talk of new prospects for finding peace in Afghanistan. Today, President Hamid Karzai angrily changed course, leaving the initiative in doubt and U.S. officials doing damage control.
The Secretary reiterated the fact that we do not recognize the name Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan.
Raising the Taliban flag on Tuesday in Doha was just a reminder of a dark and bloody past from which our country still struggles emerge.
That night, Rubin rode over to the office and demanded that the flag and banner be taken down. The Taliban complied.
This is the Taliban's new office here in Doha in Qatar. Now, the Taliban had a big inauguration ceremony. There had been a plaque there, and it said the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan.
So, after all this time, the negotiations of 3 or 4 years just falls apart.
Well, yes, but you must understand, this is not something unusual. This is how peace negotiations go.
Were you surprised when the Americans killed the talks?
Yes, it was very something disappointed to me, something disappointed to everyone, I think to all Afghans.
The Taliban refused to resume talks if their name was not recognized and if their flag was banned. But there was an agreement for a controversial prisoner swap. Several high-ranking Taliban officials in exchange for one high-profile American.
After nearly 5 years in captivity, Bo is coming home.
American soldier Bo Bergdahl, he's a free man after being handed over in exchange for 5 Afghan detainees held at Guantanamo Bay.
How was it that you were able to achieve the release of 5 of them for one American, 5 of them?
Because the Americans had invaded our country, but our prisoners, they were innocent. They were not part of the 9/11, and they were kept in Guantanamo.
And now those men are in powerful positions in your government?
Yes, they are ministers.
You know, I know it's a little late, but I was in the neighborhood, thought I'd stop by.
Ahead of Memorial Day 2014, President Obama made a surprise visit to Afghanistan.
After more than a decade of war, we're at a pivotal moment. For the first time, Afghan forces took the lead to secure their own country.
In spite of peace negotiations going nowhere, by 2014, nearly 70,000 troops had returned home from Afghanistan, and more were slated to leave soon.
For many of you, this will be your last tour in Afghanistan. And by the end of this year, the transition will be complete, and Afghans will take full responsibility for their security, and our combat mission will be over.
Obama made good on his promise, and by the end of the year, the end of the war was officially in sight. In December, at a ceremony held under heavy guard to foil Taliban attacks, the U.S. and NATO formally relinquished control to the Afghan National Security Forces.
Today, NATO completes its combat mission.
The new mission was called Operation Resolute Support. Going forward, U.S. forces would be focused on training and advising. There was another big change. Karzai's 2 terms as president were up. Responsibility would now fall on the shoulders of a new Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, a World Bank academic who famously co-wrote the book, Fixing Failed States.
President Ghani was a teacher, he was a good talker. He would impress people with his ideas. But he had this ego problem. He was condescending of others. He was a micromanager. The Americans knew it, but he was the best they had. They couldn't find a better person than him.
We're very openly proud of our foundational partnership with the United States. You're remarkable friends.
But with the Americans leaving, Ghani's hold on power was doomed. He was depending on the strength of the Afghan forces.
The Afghan National Army is an enduring tribute to your investment in sacrifice, so I want to thank you.
But the Afghan army and police forces were plagued by corruption and low morale.
Let's go! 2 more rounds! 2 more rounds! Let's go!
The annual attrition rate in the military that we were building was 30%. We were losing 30% of the Afghan National Army a year. So we're trying to build the force to 350,000, but there's this giant hole in the bucket. Even though we were the largest jobs program in Afghanistan, we could not sustain an army.
Many of you have just joined the police, is that correct? Early in the program, I spoke to some Afghans being trained in Wardak province. They told me that they simply weren't earning a living wage. Some never even received their salaries.
In the whole country, we were the only reliable employers. They were actually supposed to get paid. What happened? They didn't get paid. Their commanders ripped them off. And they eventually figured this wasn't worth it, and they walked home.
In effect, no one actually knew the true size of the Afghan National Security Forces. Basic attendance data was simply not reliably collected.
Can you tell me how many Afghan National Army personnel we've trained?
I can't.
Right.
There's no way to give you that number.
How about Afghan National Police?
We don't know. There's no
The
way
Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, John Sopko, an Obama appointee, investigated this lack of accounting and brought attention to yet another problem, that of ghost soldiers. What's a ghost soldier and what was going on here?
That's a term we've used and others have used. Actually, I heard it first from Ashraf Ghani when he was a finance minister. Went to his house for dinner, and he said, John, you realize you Americans are paying the salary of a soldier, and he doesn't exist. And that's what it was. We would be paying the salary, and somebody else would be taking the money, usually a corrupt bureaucrat.
In his summary findings, Sopko reported that the U.S. paid more than $300 million a year to soldiers that may not have existed. So where does the money go?
To the generals, to the commanders, to the defense ministers, to buy houses in California, in Virginia, in Germany, and Turkey. All the defense ministers, all the chief of army of Afghanistan, none of them is in Afghanistan, and they are all having very cozy life, very nice life, very comfortable life in Europe and Middle East.
You know, it's a disgrace that we don't have an accountable system. And here's all this money being stolen. I commend you on your work. We just got to figure out a way to stop this. And maybe
throughout 2015, the issue of higher-ups siphoning payments from ghost soldiers popped up more frequently in Sopko's reports.
Group picture. Yeah, let's get a group picture of all these guys right here.
That same year, U.S.-trained Afghan forces would face their biggest test in a provincial capital located in the far northeastern corner of Afghanistan, Kunduz. Getting there requires an arduous trip through the Salang Pass, high in the Hindu Kush Mountains. We set out in May of 2022. Once upon a time, it took a car or truck 3 days to get across here. But in 1964, a series of snow sheds and tunnels was completed by the Soviets, shortening the journey to just 10 hours. The last tunnel is the longest. By the time we reached it, traffic was backed up for miles. Like so much else in Afghanistan, the tunnel's in serious disrepair. The money that was meant to fix it has disappeared. Ventilation inside the tunnel was intermittent at best. We're in the Salang Tunnel. It's almost 3 kilometers, this long section of it. And people have been known to die from asphyxiation from carbon monoxide poisoning in here. Actually, today they've got a couple of fans working. About between 6,000 to 10,000 trucks come through here every day. In December 2022, a tanker truck overturned inside the tunnel and caught fire. 31 people died. Eventually, we emerged safely and descended towards Kunduz. First stop, I had to visit the Ministry of Information to get permission to film here. When I arrived, I was stopped by this group of war widows. Why have you come here today to the Ministry of Information? As best I could tell, they had all either lost their husbands or eldest sons and were now unable to pay for shelter or food. When you come here to the Ministry of Information, do they see you? Do they talk to you? I couldn't help them either. Kunduz has seen more fighting than most cities. By the spring of 2015, the Americans had largely pulled out of here. The countryside was in Taliban hands. As a result, the provincial capital was increasingly at risk. The defense of Kunduz would now be up to Afghan forces. What happened next foreshadowed the collapse of the Afghan army in August 2021.
The Taliban is progressing to capture the city of Kunduz in northern Afghanistan.
On Monday, some 400 to 500 Taliban soldiers swept into Kunduz in a surprise attack.
Taliban salor khana raghl kya. Bandar Khanaban, bandar Mafsa, bandar Dawlina, bandar Kabul na do khana raghl.
It was a carefully coordinated attack from 4 directions that highlights the insurgents' ability to expand beyond its southern stronghold.
There was so little resistance, Taliban fighters had time to take selfies with local residents.
The city fell on September 28, 2015. It was the Taliban's biggest victory in 14 years of war. Hundreds of prisoners from the city's jail were released amid reports of revenge killings.
Stunning defeat.
The Afghan army fled the city.
امروز امر سبکدوشی تمام منصوبین امنیت ملی را که در وظیفه خود غفلت کردن مصادره.
According to a subsequent Afghan government investigation, more than a third of Afghan forces believed to have been deployed in Kunduz either deserted or didn't exist at all. They were ghost soldiers.
که با وجود تعداد کثیر افراد دولتی ما نتونیم از کندوز به شکلی که واجبه ماست.
Back in Washington, there was worry. If the Taliban could take one of Afghanistan's largest cities, what would be next?
Well, obviously this is a setback for the Afghan security forces, but we've seen them respond in recent weeks and months.
The Afghan army clearly needed help. But under Operation Resolute Support, the U.S. was not supposed to engage in combat. Scrambling, they made an exception.
We've seen U.S. aircraft supporting the Afghan security forces because they can't do it alone just yet.
What followed was a series of mistakes and miscalculations. One night, American forces had received instructions from their Afghan partners to strike a compound that they had identified as harboring Taliban fighters. An American AC-130 gunship was called in and opened fire. They hit the wrong target. It turned out to be Kunduz's only hospital, run by Doctors Without Borders.
2 o'clock, when I heard bomb blast, all the glasses and the roof was collapsed.
Dr. Esmatullah Esmat was resting after a 12-hour shift.
After that, it was not only one bomb. It was more than hundreds, 200 bombs.
In fact, the gunship fired 211 shells.
We opened the door, and that was the most memorable moment for me, seeing this figure standing at the door.
Dr. Kathleen Thomas, an intensive care surgeon, was on her first mission with Doctors Without Borders.
There was a nurse from the ER. I recognized him immediately. His left arm had been almost completely amputated and was just hanging by a small thread, and there was a big piece of metal sticking out of his back.
42 people died in the bombing, including 24 patients and 14 Doctors Without Borders staff.
In a new report, Doctors Without Borders describes patients burning in their beds and staff members shot from the air while they fled the burning building.
Doctors Without Borders wants an international investigation into war crimes.
An Afghan government spokesman claimed the attack was justified.
10 to 15 terrorists were hiding in the hospital last night. They came under attack. Well, they are killed. All of the terrorists were killed.
I mean, that was absolute bull. There was no fighters in the hospital. There was no one armed in the hospital. There was certainly no Taliban that were using it as some sort of base.
Doctors Without Borders had repeatedly informed the coalition that it had a hospital operating in the center of Kunduz, and they had provided the Americans with GPS coordinates.
This hospital had been open for 4 years, was well lit, easily visible from the sky, and it was one of the most well-known facilities in the area.
You had those coordinates. I mean, the military had those coordinates.
Yeah, well, you're right. The fact that there was a MSF facility or Doctors Without Borders facility in Kunduz isn't a surprise to anybody. That's known.
Who called in the strike?
Ultimately, U.S. forces called in the strike. We were depending upon information we were getting from our partners on the ground with this. And again,
but it begins with your partners on the ground?
Yes, there are Afghan partners on the ground. So we're relying on information that is coming from them, and it's going up through our channels to our aircraft to actually deliver ordnance. But it was not a deliberate targeting of the Doctors Without Borders hospital. I'm convinced of that. It was a mistake that was made in a fast-developing situation with humans in the loop, with imperfect information, and it was absolutely tragic. And we are completely responsible for what happened there.
Well, after 4 days of differing stories about how that hospital came under attack, President Obama decided to call Doctors Without Borders and say he was sorry.
The United States, when we make a mistake, we own up to it. We apologize where necessary, as the president did in this case. And we implement the kinds of changes that make it less likely that those kinds of mistakes will occur in the future.
The Pentagon investigated what happened, but never publicly released their full report.
I want to emphasize that the trauma center was a protected facility.
They released only 700 heavily redacted pages.
The investigation concluded that certain personnel failed to comply with the rules of engagement and the law of armed conflict. The investigation identified 16 U.S. service members whose conduct warranted consideration for appropriate administrative or disciplinary action.
Was anybody disciplined for the, as you call it?
There were, and we did hold people accountable as a result of that.
Those names are unknown.
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to talk about that.
Were they removed from the service?
I don't know that anybody was removed. We did not remove anybody.
Was anybody court-martialed?
We didn't. We chose to go administrative measures on this.
Only with U.S. help were the Taliban routed from Kunduz. But the Taliban had proved a point. Afghan forces were weak. The entire country was vulnerable. The Taliban's momentum was undeniable.
The Taliban were gaining ground. We didn't pay a whole lot of attention, but there were markers along the way that should have signaled to us that the Taliban were going to have a voice in the future of Afghanistan. They were not going to be denied. They were not going to be defeated in anything like a military sense. The Taliban were going to have a role. And at the end of the day, they got a role. It's just not the role we imagined.
ترڅو چې افغانستان نه د تاسې بدران ونوځي ستاسې طاغوتي نظام ړنګ نشي پر ځای خالص شرعي نظام را نشي تر هغه وخته پورې به موږ په کراره کینونو ستاسو سره به زموږ جهاد جاري وي او لا به سختېږي انشاءالله